Former President Donald Trump is on the campaign trail, and he is spending a lot of time talking about tariffs. This was obviously a feature of his first presidency, and he is talking about expanding it a lot if he's elected president this year. And what Trump is saying about tariffs are that they save jobs, they help American companies. And all of this is true, but economists generally do not like tariffs. And that is because even though tariffs do save jobs and they do help companies in the short term, in the long run, they can really hamstring an economy. So let's say you've got a company in China that wants to sell socks to US consumers. It comes to the US with all of its socks, it has deals in place with all these companies, and the US says, no, wait, you need to pay a 20% tax on all these socks. So that is going to cut into the Chinese company's profits, meaning they will probably have to raise the price of their socks in order to make their business profitable. And this, of course, gives US companies a big edge. They don't have to pay these tariffs. They might be able to charge less than the Chinese company to sell their socks. Now, the problem is, and why Trump's talking about this, is if you don't have tariffs in place, China's cost of living is lower than it is in the US. Their wages tend to be lower. So it costs that Chinese company less to make the socks than it costs the American company to make the socks, because the American company has to pay American wages and the cost of living in the US is quite high, not to mention the cost of electricity and gas. All of that has to get baked into the cost of these socks. And for China, those costs are going to be a lot lower. So they can potentially offer the same quality sock for a much lower price. And so what happens is when you don't have tariffs in place, you may see American sock makers move all of their jobs overseas, or a lot of their jobs overseas, or shut down entirely. And this is what tariffs is supposed to prevent. So if all these things are true, why don't economists like tariffs? Why do they prefer free trade? Well, it's for a couple of reasons. The first one has to do with what happens to companies when they are protected, and the second reason has to do with economic evolution. So let's take the first one. A really amazing example of what happens when you put a lot of tariffs and other protections in place is Argentina. About 15 years ago, Cristina Kirchner, who was the president, essentially said to companies, you cannot sell anything in Argentina unless it is entirely made here. And the idea was to bring jobs, manufacturing, and all this knowledge back to Argentina. And it worked. I actually did a story on this back in 2017 for Planet Money called The Phone at the End of the World. What happened was Apple, who was selling a lot of iPhones in Argentina, was like, we're not going to entirely make our phones in Argentina just for the Argentine market. It doesn't make economic sense for us. So they pieced out. There were no iPhones for sale in Argentina. BlackBerry, on the other hand, decided to play ball. They started making Blackberries in Argentina. They hired a bunch of Argentine workers. They built a bunch of facilities in Argentina to make the Blackberries. And for a while, it was going really well. There were all these jobs getting created. Companies were making lots of money. People were buying the products. But what eventually happened was people got frustrated. Consumers got frustrated that they could not have iPhones. And so there was this huge black market that developed. At the same time, a lot of the products that were newly being made in Argentina started to suffer from things like high prices, low quality, things breaking a little bit, because Argentine companies did not have to compete with anybody. They had so many protections in place that they were kind of the only game in town, and this made them a little bit complacent. And these protections were really destructive for the economy. Argentina had an economic crisis. The other argument economists will make about free trade is that it allows an economy to evolve. You could argue that right now the US maybe should not be making socks, or maybe should only be making premium socks, because the resources that would go into sock making or other things that are less lucrative should be going into things where there's a much higher value placed, and it can make the economy grow exponentially. Since World War II, when free trade started to increase really dramatically, global wealth has just increased enormously. The US's wealth, as things started to be outsourced, has increased enormously. And a lot of that is because certain industries have evolved away. So the jobs that might pay less, like working in a sock factory, get replaced by jobs that might pay more, like working at Google or something like that. Now, this is not a perfect system, and when these jobs go away, it causes real destruction. You have towns that are decimated, you have thousands of people that are jobless. Free trade has a high price, but the price of opting out of free trade might be higher because economies get held back. Companies don't evolve the way they normally would. And now Trump did put quite a few tariffs in place back in 2016, and Biden has by and large left those tariffs in place. So you could argue, hey, the tariffs were put in place, our economy has grown pretty amazingly since then. So what gives? The tariffs that Donald Trump is proposing now are a lot more widespread than the tariffs that he put in place back in 2016. So we really could see a lot of the downsides of tariffs come into play if tariffs that are this widespread get put into place.